Welcome to the Chasing Something podcast with me, Lorinda Pretorius. Here we get real and raw about the struggles and the joys of being a young adult following Jesus in a post-Christian world. Join me as I engage in tough, controversial, and highly relevant conversations to enable you to thrive in your chase. Before we get into today's episode, I just wanted to take a few seconds to tell you about the More Gathering by my favorite ministry, Moral Revolution. This gathering or conference is 2 days from the 17th to the 18th of July 2020. It will be online and it's specifically for Jesus-loving women. It's called the More Gathering because the motto is you're more than your past, you are more than your body, and you are more than enough. And they'll share incredible testimonies of people overcoming sexual trauma, body image issues, pornography addiction, and failures. I just really want to encourage you to buy a ticket to this gathering because it will be so life-giving and life-changing. There will be a link in the description where you can buy your ticket. Without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. Hi beautiful people, and welcome to today's episode. I'm honestly so excited for this episode because I have my friend Sarah here with me, and she's just going to share her journey of how she got addicted to pornography and her testimony of how she overcame this addiction. I think this is a topic that we don't talk enough about in the church, especially when it comes to women. So I really hope that this episode will just shed some light on this journey and how we can support our fellow sisters struggling with this. So welcome, Sarah. I just want to honor you for your willingness to share your story and just to be so vulnerable with essentially a bunch of strangers. So could you just introduce yourself to the audience and tell them a little more about who you are and any information that you think is relevant?
Thank you so much for having me. So I grew up in New York, but I've been living in South Africa for almost the past 2 years as a teacher. I teach first grade, so that's a lot of fun. I also run a blog called Becoming Shiny, so I really love writing and poetry, and I do a lot of artwork as well that I tie in with my sort of creative practice. So yeah, I've been enjoying having all this free time during quarantine to just be able to tap more into that.
That's amazing. I'm honestly such a fan of your blog and your writing and even your artworks. You're just such a talented person. But yeah, we'll definitely put all the links to any of your social media and your blog and everything in the description so everyone can go check that out, which I highly recommend. So yeah, let's just jump straight into this topic. Can you start by telling us a little bit about how you got into porn? Who introduced you to it? Was it just a curiosity? But also, how did this develop from something you maybe did once or twice to an addiction?
Yeah, so I'd say it's kind of my curiosity that got me into it in the first place. I was really blessed actually to grow up in a wonderful Christian home that I know there's a negative connotation with the word sheltered, so I wouldn't say that I was sheltered, but my parents did a really good job of, protecting us from, a lot of the media that's out there. And they were wonderful in that they viewed sex very positively, and they were open. They explained, at appropriate ages what it was, and that it was a good and a beautiful thing, and explained how, it's meant for marriage, and it's not a constraint, but it's something that, the Lord has done to actually protect us and bring us the most joy. So I grew up understanding that. I grew up with, I knew what pornography was, but I had no idea the extent that it was addictive, or that it could even affect women as well. I didn't even know how huge of an issue it was with men. I just kind of knew that, like, oh, porn is, people will video people having sex, and that was about the extent that I knew. So the first time that I was ever exposed to anything sort of pornographic was through a film that we were actually assigned to watch in one of the college courses that I was taking. So I was around 17, and that was the first time that I had ever seen an explicit scene, and it always really stuck with me. And so I think I mentioned that I struggled with masturbation before the image kind of component of porn became attached to that. And so that was something that I was struggling with, and that initial scene always really stuck in the back of my mind. And over the years, as that other problem kind of grew, it became attached to I would make a lot of excuses for myself. And it started with, I would just see what I could find in YouTube or in different PG movies that I could find on Netflix. And I was very much in denial that, these scenes were doing more harm than good. And for me, it was, I struggled a lot on and off, where I would have periods of time where I would be completely, quote unquote, clean, and wouldn't be looking anything up, but maybe I would be replaying the scenes in my mind, or and then other seasons where I would fall back into that, and I would just have weeks on end where I would just like binge whatever I could find. And so it was really a slow and gradual kind of building up for me, until eventually one day I found that I had progressed from what I could find on YouTube to what I could find in TV shows that are, kind of known for for having these explicit scenes, to one day finding myself on a quote-unquote ethical porn site. And even then, I was justifying what I was doing. If people aren't familiar with the term ethical porn, it refers, in the industry, it refers to production companies that are supposedly really good about testing their performers and making sure that they're safe, and everything is supposed to be super consensual, which, I mean, we can get into this later. There's no such thing as ethical porn. There is no such thing. It's just not possible. But in my mind, I was like, oh, well, this is ethical, and so this isn't as bad as, quote unquote mainstream, hardcore porn. So I was totally in denial, but it just was this thing that gradually built over the years, until I kind of woke up, one day and realized, like, man, I've been calling this a struggle, but I need to use stronger language for this, because for the past 7 years of my life, this has been something I wanted to quit, but could not. And so that's why you'll hear me throughout our conversation. I'll refer to myself as being addicted. I know it's a strong word, but I feel like it's appropriate in my case, because, I mean, even though I had seasons, weeks and an occasional month or two of sobriety where I wouldn't look anything up, I always ended up in the same place, and always ended back where I had kind of started. So when you hear those terms, that's kind of the context, and the explanation for why I use them and apply them to myself.
So Sarah, you just shared a little bit about how you got into your pornography addiction, but you said that there was a moment that you realized you were addicted to pornography. And it kind of seems that was kind of a moment of freedom or relief at least in a sense for you, because you were able to identify your issue and then seek help for what's really going on. So would you say that being able to identify your problem as a pornography addiction, how harsh or whatever that might sound, that actually was a moment of freedom for you?
Yeah, it definitely was, because, I mean, it took me almost 7 years to reach the point where I looked back and realized, like, this isn't just, like, a timely struggle that crops up every once in a while, but this has been something that I've been coming against for 7 years and have been wanting to stop but haven't been able to. And so using that term to encompass kind of the severity of it, even though, you know, I wasn't watching every day and I'd go through seasons of sobriety, it really helped me to stop making excuses for myself and to actually face the problem and say, no, like this is more than just an occasional struggle. This is a deep habitual, you know, sin that I've been wrestling with for the past 7 years and have not been able to break. And so I just really felt that I needed to use a stronger word so that I could actually, face it and call it for what it was and bring it out into the light. So,
do you feel like when you weren't identifying it as an addiction, you were really just downplaying it to yourself? And yeah, because honestly, I think a lot of people or within society, there's this idea that, like, kind of as long as you're not addicted, it's okay. And yeah, like, could you kind of elaborate a little bit on that? Do you think that if we were able to admit to ourselves I don't know what the word is exactly, the dependence we have on something, that we would be able to seek help earlier?
Yeah. I mean, I think understanding that it is a problem in the first place is definitely necessary, because not everybody does view pornography as a problem. They think somehow that it has benefits, and I know we'll talk about the harms of it later. So I'd say realizing that it's harmful is a huge step. But I think part of the problem, even more so than just calling it an addiction, because I know that there's some people that maybe it's only a very occasional one, and they wouldn't want to use such a strong term like that, but they realize it's still a problem. I'd say a huge issue is that we're not talking about it. So whether a person feels like, man, I occasionally struggle with this and I feel really bad about it and I want to stop doing what I'm doing, or if somebody has what they would consider a really intense addiction where it's just eating up their time and their finances and their relationships, and it's something that maybe they're watching every day. If we don't have that freedom to say, here's a safe place, we're not going to shame you for coming forward about it, and we're going to honor you and we want to help you. If there's not that place, it keeps a lot of people, regardless of how intense your struggle or your addiction is, from coming forward and getting that help. So I think admitting you have a problem is important, but also there needs to be a place to share that problem. And we're seeing that, especially within our churches, unfortunately, there's been a big lack of openness.
Yeah, so let's kind of touch a little bit on that, the idea or the shame linked to pornography addiction, and kind of this idea that porn is a guy's issue. How has that affected your journey with pornography? How has that affected the way you viewed your own struggle? But also, how has that hindered you from really facing your own addiction and coming forward?
Yeah, it was a huge problem for me growing up. in that even though I was aware of what pornography was, I had no idea how common of a problem it was. And I mean, if you look statistically, I read a study and it was talking about how 90% of men, 70% of women are exposed to porn before the age of 18. The average exposure of pornography in the States is 11 years old. So I didn't even know how common of an issue it was, and especially I had never heard another woman talk about struggling with it. And even if it was addressed in church, which I can think of maybe 3 times in my life that I've ever heard it addressed, it was always, comments were always directed towards the men. So internally, I wasn't just feeling the shame of like, I'm struggling with watching pornography, but there was also a shame that I felt that there was something inherently broken within me as a woman, like that there was something within my very femininity that was just so broken and messed up because I didn't know that this was something that women could struggle with too. I literally felt like I was the only woman on the planet that struggled with this problem. And it's interesting because since I've started opening up more about my story, I've had a lot of different people reach out to me, and it's all ages too. Like there's a 60-year-old woman who like reached out to me and told me like, yeah, I struggled with this. And that's even before, she was exposed to it before internet pornography was even a thing. And so it's this intergenerational problem. And I think that because we're not open about it, we feel that shame all the more because we're not having these conversations. I mean, I've been to 6 different churches, like regularly attended them over the course of the past, 5 or 6 years because I've lived in 3 different countries and I went to college, and I never heard a sermon preached about this topic in a single one of those. I've heard of support groups that they have for people that are wrestling with this. I've never seen one. I've went to youth group and different young adult studies. I've never heard this addressed in any of them. And I think the church maybe doesn't realize that our silence is actually communicating that either we don't think this is important enough to talk about, or that I think more commonly it's so taboo that it has no place, to talk about, and we just, shun. If you're struggling with this, then you shouldn't bring it up. You shouldn't talk about it. It's such a shameful thing. You need to deal with it. So yeah, I'd say there's a huge silence on the part of the church, and it's damaging. And I don't want to blame the church, for everything, but I think too, parents might not be aware of how big of an issue this is, and I love Fight the New Drug, and they published an article recently where they were talking about, parents, it's not if your child sees porn, it's when. And so when you talk to them about sex and relationships, you need to start involving pornography within those conversations, just so not to scare them or to shame them, but to also let them know, like, if you struggle with this, it's okay. You can come, you can talk to me about this issue.
Yeah. I actually very often have conversations with my mom about sexuality, and it's really great that we're in this space where we can have these conversations. But I mean, when I was little, there wasn't even a conversation. Like, my parents did not tell me about sex. They gave me like a book or something that I had to read. But in having this conversation, I realized, and it also depends on where you are, but for instance, in my culture, like when my mom was a little girl, you would never speak about sex. Like, you would never, ever, like, it is just like a hush type of thing. Like, there's no conversation about it ever. And then, like, that definitely contributed to their parenting style, where they were like a little bit more open, but when it came to certain topics, it was still very like, silence is the best answer. Like, just don't talk about it. But now that we've been, like, we're both pretty open about it right now, and we have various conversations about it, my mom would tell me, like, she did not grow up in the world that I grew up in. And I think sometimes for parents, it's really hard to grasp the fact that your children is so, like, growing up in this extremely over-sexualized world. Because if I take a look at my mom's life, right, she doesn't really watch TV. She doesn't really watch movies. Maybe every, like, once in 3 months. Maybe. Like, that's even a lot. Like, she might like, it's not like she never watches videos. Maybe she'll watch YouTube videos, but it will all be in her interest area. She has Facebook, but she's only on there, like, once a week maybe, and she only has a few friends on it. And so she's aware of social media. But it does not have the effect that it has on this generation. She's not constantly on Instagram seeing whatever she's seeing. She's not binge watching series or whatever. And of course, some parents are more maybe in touch with technology and more partake a bit more in the current media situation. But I do think, and this is not to justify parents not talking about it, but I do think parents need to realize in the past 20 years, the world has changed so much, you know? Like you said just now, it isn't a question of whether your children will see pornography. It really is a question of when. And we need to equip people to handle these situations well, but like you said as well, like, we need to create spaces that is safe for people to talk about it. I think the church, especially when it comes to sexuality, definitely has this idea that talking about something makes it either less sacred or more okay. You know, like when we talk about sin, it's justifying it. But that's so not true. Conversations are the way that we heal, you know, and like, shame is not from God. And it's a little sad that we are the people shaming others for their struggles instead of being a place where they can come and find healing. But on the topic kind of sexuality, could you tell us a little bit about what effect your porn addiction had on your view of your own sexuality, but also just the effect that it had on your spiritual, emotional, and even physical health?
Yeah, so it definitely affected all of those areas. And I love, you've said it multiple times on previous podcasts, that our souls and our bodies are intertwined, right? And even in Matthew 6:22 to 23, it talks about how our eye is like this lamp that provides a light for our body. And so when we're filling our eyes and we're looking at things that are light and that are healthy, our whole body is healthy. But when our eye is unhealthy, our whole body is filled with darkness. And so it definitely has an effect on all of those areas. I mean, in terms of how I viewed sex, like, I came from a background where I was blessed that we had these healthy conversations. So I knew it was a distorted view of sex and sexuality, and that it wasn't real. But it ultimately turned it into this selfish, self-pleasing act, and distorts the whole view of, you know, sex is supposed to be about serving the other person, and it's supposed to be this joyous thing, and it distorted it into this thing that just brought shame. And I knew it was improperly placed. And in terms of my own sexuality, I mentioned it just now, but like, I thought something within my very femininity was broken. Like, not that I was a broken person, but I was a broken woman. And spiritually too, I just felt this constant weight of guilt and shame. And I'd say the worst was I felt like such a hypocrite, because, you know, even to this day, I've always had very strong standards for I know we don't like the word, but purity. And so here I was, I still haven't had my first kiss, and I've been in a pretty serious relationship, but here I am struggling with porn. So how do I even justify that? And I was serving in the church, and I came from this wonderful Christian family, and I was this quote unquote like good Christian girl. So the weight of that hypocrisy was just awful. And I felt like I couldn't go to God right away and ask for forgiveness after I'd stumbled, because I felt like I deserved to feel those feelings of shame and guilt, because I knew what I was doing was wrong. And I was suppressing the conviction of the Holy Spirit on my life. And I felt like if I was to like bounce back and ask for his forgiveness right away, instead of, making sure that I had spent a few days clean and I'd been in the Word, that I was abusing his grace. And so it was hard. And I felt like there were times where I went up for every altar call, and I, would sit there and weep and just beg him to take, this thing away from me. And so there's feelings of disillusionment. But once again, I was misusing my own free will in that. So there was definitely a spiritual separation. Emotionally, once again, those feelings of hypocrisy were crippling. I genuinely hated myself. Like, that passage in, I think it's in Romans, where Paul is talking about how, I don't understand my own actions, and I don't do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Like, that was my life for the past, 7 years. And so I very much felt like that. And I had a hard time accepting compliments from other people, because there was this constant kind of voice in my mind, in the back of my mind, saying, like, if you only knew, like, you would take that back. Your view of me would completely change. And there's been a few times I've bristled where people have told me, oh, God is so proud of you, and like the work you're doing is so great. And I haven't been able to accept that, because it's like, well, if only you knew, you would think completely different of me. You didn't know what I did last night. You haven't seen the things that I've seen. And I was really afraid. That kept me in fear, that fear of rejection for a long time, because I was afraid that other people, if I brought this up, they would affirm what I already felt about who I was as a person, that they would affirm that, yes, you are super broken and you're gross and, you're just super messed up. And, and physically too. Like I felt like I've just been tired for the past, 6 or 7 years of my life, because it takes a physical toll on you. And there were periods of time where I felt like I couldn't get to sleep unless I'd had a quote unquote fix, and that messes up everything. So yeah, everything is intertwined, and it really, it was difficult, and it's a weighty thing to carry.
Could you tell me, right, so a lot of the effects that you're naming, some of them are just linked to being human, but a lot of them are linked to kind of like your spiritual life and like what we believe God says about us, and his truth, like how porn is contradicting that. But now I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit, like, what is your opinion on whether porn is harmful just in general? Like, if someone is addicted to pornography, but they're not Christian, so, I mean, they don't view sex as something sacred, and, there's just a lot of things that you're going through that they might not go through right now. Like, some of them obviously will be similar, but on like a more on a more secular level, why do you think porn is so harmful? Like, I know Fight the New Drug, which is this great like anti-porn organization, they're not linked to any religious organization. They're fighting the porn industry and for freedom of porn addiction, but they're not linked to like for instance, Christianity. So what's your thoughts on why is porn harmful?
Yeah, no, I definitely suggest looking into Fight the New Drug, and I'll kind of use their framework for talking about it. But porn affects our brains. There's been links that have been found between porn consumption and the amount of gray matter in our brains. So it can literally affect your decision making and your intelligence. The dopamine hits that porn gives your brain. So that's like, this happy chemical that it's released, relationally, like when you're actually having sex or when you're enjoying really good food or things like that. And you're meant to come down from that little hit of dopamine high. It's also, when we see our likes or comments on social media, it also gives a little hit to our brain. But the problem with pornography is that because there's this endless supply, and oftentimes, we don't stop at just watching one. But the more frequently you view porn, you actually build up a tolerance to your dopamine levels. And so it takes more frequent viewing and more kind of extreme versions of pornography to give you those same dopamine hits. So that's why even in my case, you can see how it started with, a movie scene, and then it progressed to, just what I can find on YouTube, and eventually to the point where it built and built and built. And then all of a sudden I was finding myself on actual porn sites. So it's a thing that it escalates over time. And there's been links. Once again, I refer you to Fight the New Drug. They have all the official names and data that go along with it. But they have links between anxiety and depression, and this is in both men and women, that are connected with porn consumption. So we can talk about how it can affect you relationally. That it's damaging. I heard a statistic that was talking about how in almost 50% of divorces, porn is listed as it's one of the contributing factors. Not to say that that's the cause of everything, but I know there's two German psychologists that have been pretty prominent, and they found over the long term that men who watch a lot of pornography are less likely to be monogamous and faithful in their relationships and in their marriages. And, and it can place a strain on the relationship because it takes you away from the person that's in front of you and building actual intimacy with them. It contributes to poor body image issues and gives an unrealistic view of sex because you're seeing maybe 15-minute, 20-minute film that took, an entire production team and 3 days to film and has been touched up digitally, and there's been surgical enhancements that have happened, and you're not seeing any of that. So people are getting unrealistic expectations of what your body should be and what you should look like, and these different beauty standards. We can talk about societally how you cannot separate the porn industry from the human trafficking industry. With especially Exodus Cry has been leading this petition and this movement called Trafficking Hub, and there's just been such horrendous stories that have come out about teenagers. I think the main story that kind of ignited all of this was this. I think she was 14 or 15 years old, and her assault was filmed and posted to Pornhub, and she tried to get it taken down for 6 months. And it was, telling the executives of Pornhub that it was non-consensual and that it was child pornography. I mean, she was 14 or 15 at the time, and it wasn't until she pretended that she was a lawyer and threatened to sue them that they took it down. And this is not an isolated case. there's been multiple stories of
Yeah.
performers that have been held at gunpoint, even forced to perform, or girls go in and they're told that, okay, you're going to do this type of scene, and then they get there and they're coerced into doing something a lot more extreme than what they had initially signed up for. Or I know there's another case, Girls Do Porn, I think, where they were initially told that, oh, it's a photo shoot and it's a swimsuit shoot, and they were once again coerced into doing things that they didn't want to do. And so, there's you can't I think look at any of these things and justify consuming porn. I know a lot of people too think like, oh well, it's a great way to learn how to have sex, and there's been surveys that talk about how I think 16 to 18-year-old boys, the majority of them said that that's where they, learned how to perform sexually. And I love her name is Jamila Jamil. Or Jamil. I'm probably mispronouncing her name, but she's an actress, and she talks about how learning sex from porn is like learning how to drive from watching The Fast and the Furious, and it's leading to teens acting out, and even within, marriages, I've heard different stories where there's been a partner that's been addicted to having these unrealistic expectations of what sex is, and thinking that things are pleasurable and good when they're actually painful. And so they end up hurting their partner instead of, loving them well. So there's just, I literally have like 3 pages of why porn is trash, but there's just so many reasons not to watch. I don't think you can ever justify, consuming it or claiming that it has any benefit, because no, it just doesn't.
No, I completely agree. I think that when people say that it has benefits, they're definitely kind of just lying to themselves. And you know what? If you want to watch porn, get like your friend and another friend who's willing to have sex in front of you. That's how I feel. I'm like, that's fine. Because the thing is just that realistically, there is no way that you can support the porn industry and, like you said, and say that it's ethical, because there's just no control. Like, there's just too many stories, like, especially right now with this trafficking hub petition, which, by the way, if you're listening to this, I'll put the link in the description. Please go sign that petition if you haven't already. So many stories of people who were raped, and it was filmed, and Pornhub takes no responsibility for that. If we think about the Black Lives Matter movement right now, people saying, oh, Black Lives Matter, but then you're watching a porn video titled White Master Beating Black Slave. Like, how can you separate this? How can you say Black Lives Matter, but then literally watch videos that are based on racism firstly, but also just other people making money of this exploitation? Like, it is, I thought it was really ridiculous. I saw this post, I think it was from Fight the New Drug. Was it them? No, I can't remember. Anyway, basically, it was posting about how a lot of porn, like the porn industry, profits from racism based on the titles of their videos and what type of videos it is, obviously. Because also, I don't know how so many feminists can promote pornography when almost, like, I know the majority of it is either violent towards women, or it could be showing that it was kind of against their will, or like it's not at all uplifting women, or so that's also just ridiculous. But there was this person commenting saying like, oh, I'm all for Black Lives Matter, but like don't kink shame someone. And then the account that posted like about the titles that were racist, they were like, oh, well, I'm sorry, but like if white master beats black slave is not racist to you, I don't know what is. And it was kind of just like this interesting thing where, and it's not to shame that person specifically because I don't know who that is, but it's like this person is representing a group of people who think they can separate what they watch on porn sites and real life matters, you know? If you want to support equality and you want to uplift women, you cannot watch a porn video where a woman is being beat or like whatever the case may be. Like, that is not uplifting. And to pretend that that does not have an effect on the way you view women is definitely, like, it's so naive. It's scientifically proven that your thoughts form your brain. Like, it actually forms your brain matter. So the things you think about will form the way you see the world. And in a country like South Africa, with gender-based violence being so huge, you cannot take away the role that pornography plays in this. It has a huge, because it starts from a small age and with small things, and it's just, yeah, you can't separate those things. A very interesting and maybe too much information type of topic that I want to touch on right now is that I actually found this video on BuzzFeed where this girl, it's titled "Why I Hated My Vagina," and I was like, oh, this is interesting, let me watch this. And it was so shocking to me because this woman was like, oh, I just really hated my vagina. And she was also talking about how she had, like, she wasn't addicted to pornography, but she has watched porn before. And she's always thought, like, oh my gosh, like, my vagina does not look like that. And then she went to this plastic surgeon to find out about this procedure that I can't remember the name of, but it's basically to change the way your vagina looks. And statistically, so many girls, and they're under 18, want to go consult for this procedure. And I was just like, this is crazy. This is actually crazy. So this is not only is pornography giving you a false presentation of what sex is and what your body should look like, it's also giving you a false idea of what your vagina should look like and what is acceptable, which is just ridiculous, honestly. Like, I'm like, this is not okay. Why are we promoting these type of things? Because what I find ironic about this is that a lot of times people who are like, oh, I'm body positive, I'm pro everything, they're usually also pro pornography. Then I'm like, this is so, like, kind of hypocritical, because you're like, oh, I'm so pro body positivity, but, like, I also endorse this thing that shows you that your vagina is not normal and you need to change it.
Yeah, and I think it's important to realize, because especially if you're outside of, this problem, or maybe you're just a casual user or whatever, we might think like, oh, that sounds a little bit extreme, and you can't make these generalizations. Go and look up Fight the New Drug. They have listed that Pornhub released themselves the top categories that were searched last year. And so many of them have to do with violence or incest to some point, or fetishizing of Asian and Black people. Like, we're not exaggerating here. And when we talk about the violence, there was a study that was done where it looked at the top 50 selling porn films of all time. 88% of them showed aggression towards women. Like 88%. And I mean, if we're going to, reference studies, the American Psychological Association talks about, they have a study called What You See Is What You Do. And it, links, and it talks about how risk glorifying media exposure is directly linked to more risky behavior. And you're seeing that with these women that are pursuing cosmetic surgeries. But we can also talk about, on the side of men, how porn-induced erectile dysfunction is like a thing, and it's increasing. And you're having, young men, teenagers that are struggling with this. So it affects you. Like, it literally affects you. And once again, I think there is no way that we can look and say that we are anti-human trafficking, anti-slavery, that we are for human rights when the porn industry routinely just appropriates these different stereotypes and takes advantage of those that are within the LGBTQ community and Black people and Asian people, and mistreats the women and men, and how directly linked it is to human trafficking. Like, they are inseparable. There is no way to tell whether the porn that you are watching was coerced or not. And especially what's terrifying too is there's a whole category of abuse porn, and there's no way to tell if that's actual abuse that you're seeing on screen or if it's acted out. And even if it is acting out, why? I think we need to take a step back and say, why is this something that we're desiring? Once again, not to shame anyone, but to take an honest look and see that this is hurting us. And I think it's an unloving thing to say, like, no, it's okay and it's normal, and this is just, we need to be more body positive, and we need to, we need to not shame people about sex. But it is unloving for me to know all of this and not tell you and not warn you, because it's not just a personal thing, like, it's a systemic societal problem as well.
Yeah. That's the thing is that it starts, or it looks like a small thing. I mean, obviously percentage-wise, it's actually a pretty big thing, but the thing is just like, it looks like, oh, this is just my problem, but like we said, and you cannot separate these things from huge societal issues that we have, or even like you said, contributing to divorce, but also just relationships within the church. I actually have had so many people reach out to me. Earlier this year, I wrote this article, and it was called "To All the Good Single Men" or something like that. And like, there was this one guy who reached out to me, and he was like, well, what if the good Christian single men just aren't that good? And he was like going on this whole rant, telling me about how many like people are addicted to pornography, and like just how the struggle is really real, and how it also changes the way, yes, they view women, but also the way they approach women, and whether they can flirt or not. And it's just like this very interesting thing. But I was just like, yeah, like, what if, and not to say like you're not a good person or anything like that, but just like the effects it has on the society, or like the church. Like, we cannot be silent about this issue, and not to be in a space of condemnation. We need to be clear about where we stand, yes, of course, and we should be clear about the consequences of all these things, but we need to create a space where people feel comfortable to share, where they can find help to walk through this. Because if you're not addicted to pornography, you probably know someone who is. Or maybe you don't know they're addicted, but they probably are, and that will affect your life. Like, yes, it's about personal responsibility, but it's also about community, realizing that not everybody, or I think a lot of times when you're in this hole, you're not able to help yourself out of it. And if you have a supportive community that loves you in the midst of that and really supports you on your journey to freedom, that it can really help you. So we've now definitely clarified how harmful and why it contributes to so many societal issues. But let's talk about the other side of things. Let's talk about your journey to freedom. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came to be? And could you also give us some practical tips and or resources that you used on your journey to freedom?
Yeah. And so first off, what I want to say is to anybody that's listening to this, whether you're a man or a woman, I imagine that there's a lot of women that are tuning into this. The first thing that you need to know is that you are not alone, and that you are not an especially broken woman or man or person, but you are human, and this is your struggle or your addiction, whatever word you want to use, is not a surprise to Jesus. Like he knew that you were going to be at this point where you are, and this is the entire reason why he came to die for you, to take away that shame. So I think first, know that you're loved and you're not alone in this, and that's something that I wish that I had learned a lot sooner in my struggle. And another thing that I just want to say, like, my road to freedom was like pretty long. Like, I think sometimes we have this idea, and I'm not saying that God can't do it, because God can absolutely reach down and just take away your desire and take away this issue from you. I believe he's a God of miracles. That just wasn't the case for me. It took a lot of stumbling and growing, and for me too, a lot of learning not to live in denial of how serious the problem was, before I've reached this place where I consider myself like I'm fully walking in freedom. So all that to say, for me, I had struggled for about 2 years before I told anyone. And I was still very much in denial about the image portion of this, but I'd say, that really only escalated within the past maybe 3 or 4 years of my life. But it was definitely a component that was there. But it reached a point where I just realized, like, I can't just keep on doing this alone. Like, I feel like I'm being eaten up on the inside. And so I spent a lot of time in prayer, just, asking the Lord, okay, who do I need to tell? And he directed me to this one friend, and it was terrifying. Like, that entire day, like, when I made up that decision that, okay, today is the day that I'm going to go and tell her, like, I felt physically sick. Like, I ducked into the bathroom a few times, maybe too much in information, and was literally like dry heaving. Like, I felt so, ashamed. And I think that, if anybody is listening and, your friend comes forward and tells you, like, know how much it took out of them to come and tell you, because it's a lot. So I went and I sat down and I told this friend, and I focused more on my issue with masturbation, but it was so incredible. And I look back and I just see, like, God's goodness in this, that she looked back at me and said, I struggled with that too. Like, you're not alone. And that first instance of hearing that, like, I'm not the only one who struggles with this, was just incredible for me. And it was definitely the beginning of that process. And kind of slowly over the years, I began to tell a handful of people that were close to me. I told my middle sister pretty early on what was going on, but I still stumbled a lot through it. And it wasn't, like I said, until recently, within, last year, that I finally, I wasn't even calling my struggle with, like, pornography. I was just saying, oh, like, I struggle with, like, like sexualized movie scenes or whatever. But totally, once again, was in denial, because I had a lot of shame around that. And so I'd say it was really helpful when I said, like, no, like, I have a problem with porn specifically, and I need to take this seriously. And I told this friend who works at my school, and she's very much a mentor figure to me, and she lives there with me. And I told her, and just once again, having her affirm that, I love you anyway, was amazing. And it took that question that I talked about earlier of, like, if you only knew, like, all of a sudden I was finding that, like, this person, and these people that I love and respect so much do know, and they still love me. And I just felt like that's the strongest that I felt the Lord's love was actually in those awkward conversations, but still being met with such love and compassion and grace. And so with telling that friend at school, that was when I really started to take things, like, kind of seriously. And I actually like went out and I bought a battery run alarm clock. And I said, enough is enough. And I really want to kick this thing. And so I started like turning my phone into her at 8 o'clock every night and just made it clear with her. Like we talked and she's this person where she's completely free to ask me at any time how I'm doing. And I feel the freedom to go and tell her, when I've messed up, and I know that she'll meet me with love, but also, tell me to my face, tell me like it is. So that was another huge thing. But what's so amazing about this, about my story, and I've only realized this recently in writing all of this down over the past days, but how good God is and how he often brings things full circle. But right before I published an article on my blog where I talk about my story, and interestingly enough, all throughout these wrestlings, from that first time that friend that I had no idea had struggled with it, from the first time that I knew that I was not alone, I wanted to be that voice for other women. But I felt like because I was still struggling with it, because I knew how powerful that was for me, but because I was still struggling for it, I just felt so totally disqualified to talk to the issue. And I kept on having these deadlines where it's I want to be completely clean, not having watched anything, not having, because the problem too with me is and this is once again where excuses come in, and they're sneaky, because there'd be some times where it's I wouldn't watch, but I could pull up any scene that I had seen over the past few years and kind of use that. So it's too much information. So I kept setting these deadlines where it's well, I want to be 6 months completely free of watching and, even thinking about it before I feel like it's okay for me to come forward. But, I had, I had stumbled. And so I called this friend that I had first told my problem to. And I told her, I'm just so frustrated. And that was the first time where I used the word addicted, where I'm I have been trying to beat this thing and I just cannot, and I'm addicted. And she reminded me of the goodness of the Lord, and that I didn't have to do it in my own strength. And not only that, but she really challenged me. And I know in the last podcast, you talked about Paul and how, he went from being this murderer, and over the course of a weekend, all of a sudden he's speaking about the gospel. And she challenged me. She's Paul started preaching immediately and sharing his testimony. And, he didn't wait until he had proved himself, to share his story and everything. He went out and he told the world of what God had done for him. And I think because I have such a fear of failure too, that there's this word, well, what if I come forward and then I struggle again, and then, these feelings of hypocrisy are just going to become unbearable for me. But she really challenged me in that. And I decided then and there, okay, I'm going to type out my story. And I sent it to my pastor's wife before, and just relevant people, and asked them to take a look over it. And I posted it. And honestly, there's been such a freedom I've never known before. And it's been amazing to hear the stories of so many other people that have come, dropped in my messages before, and all literally from all over the world, all different ages, that have said I've struggled with this too. And I didn't know that this was such a common thing. And so I love there's two verses. I don't know if I can remember the references right off the top of my head, but one that talks about how, here it is, James 5:16, and it says, confess your sins to one another and pray for each other so that you may be healed. And so even in the act of confessing and stepping up and saying, this is something that I am struggling with, not just have, but I am struggling with, has been so healing in my life. And Revelations 12:11, and it talks about how they overcame him, and they're talking about Satan in this context, by the blood of the Lamb. So, understanding too my place with Jesus, and understanding that, this doesn't shock him. None of this has ever shocked him. this is the reason he died. Like, he didn't come to die for the best version of Sarah. Like, he came and died for my sins. He came and died for my shame. And so, you know, I really needed to accept that. So, but, you know, that's how we overcome, by the blood of the Lamb. So understanding the gospel truly, but also by the word of their testimony, and just hearing these other stories, and in that sharing, it's been amazing for me personally, the freedom that's come from that. But yeah, so there's been aspects. I know that you were asking about, like, practical things that you can do as well, and that's a huge part of it. And once again, I'll refer back to, like, our bodies and souls are intertwined. And, like, for the Christian, nothing is secular. Like, everything that we're supposed to do is meant to be an act of worship, whether that's, you know, feeding ourselves well, or, you know, being patient in our driving, or pursuing the way that we intentionally pursue healing and monitor what we take in. So I would say practically, the biggest thing is tell someone. Like, really pray for guidance, or somebody that, you know, or think about somebody that you really trust, whether it's a friend or a peer. I would encourage it to be somebody of the same sex, and tell them about it, and let them into your story. And, you know, I think people should listen to your thing about boundaries. But invite them into your healing process, even just as a listening ear, and enlist their help if they're willing to help you. So, like I said, it's been helpful to have that mentor at the school that I work at, where, you know, she's doing practical things where it's like, I know, you know, when I live at school, I turn my phone in, and that's one little thing that really helps. I'd say educating yourself about it. There's wonderful websites, Fight the New Drug. I encourage everybody to go and listen. There's a poem by Ezekiel Azanwu called Exodus. That's excellent. I'd say really monitor what it is that you are watching, and be super diligent. And you can check, there's a website called Plugged In where you can go, and it covers movies, TV shows, and music. And you can go before you plan to watch a Netflix show, before you plan to go and see a movie or watch with friends, you can go ahead of time and check and see if there's going to be anything that's going to potentially trigger you, and trigger that struggle within you. And so just, you know, avoiding it. And I think that one of the things that you need to actively do as well is, get to the heart of the issue and understand, okay, what is causing this, and not just treating the symptoms. And so obviously as believers, we know it's a sin issue.
But also what triggers it? Like, what lie are you believing?
Yes.
Because I know, because obviously pornography and masturbation are, like, they're very intertwined, and you very rarely see the two separated, you know? But I know Moral Revolution has this whole thing on masturbation where they're like, well, if you want to masturbate, like, ask yourself, like, what do you need right now? Do you feel disconnected? Are you actually feeling lonely right now? Do you actually feel unworthy? Did someone say something that triggered a feeling of unworthiness? Because generally, pornography, like any addiction, is only an escape from, like, you're trying to escape a reality or a lie that you're believing about yourself. So really the only way to actually live in freedom is to find the lie and to combat it with truth, and to realize when you're triggered. So, like, if I'm alone for a week and I didn't hang out with my friends, I feel lonely, so then I turn to porn or whatever. And then instead of turning to porn, calling up your friends and being like, I need a sleepover right now. Or, you know, like those type of things.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it is, getting to the root of it. I know for me, and I'm not blaming this, but my reaction to, I had a breakup that was really difficult, and a lot of the way that I dealt with those feelings of uncomfortability, and I felt a lot of guilt too for just, I look back and there were so many ways that I was broken and contributed to that I would, that's where I would go to. I'd go to porn, but I think knowing your triggers. So there's something that I learned about back when I was studying education, and we talk about identifying and targeting different behaviors in children, like if they're hitting their neighbor or they get unruly, and you do this thing called an ABC check. And so be really aware of what you are thinking and doing before you engage in either masturbating or watching pornography or both. And so you talk about so your antecedent, what happened before, and understanding too, there are emotional triggers, but also there's physical triggers. Like if you are feeling hungry or tired or bored, you might be more vulnerable. Like for me, tiredness was a huge trigger, as well as sadness. And so understanding, okay, what came before? B, behavior. Okay, how did I respond to that? So, did I engage in something that was life-giving and healthy, or did I go back to this old crutch of mine? And then C is consequence. So actively thinking not just, okay, what should I be looking out for, but how did I actually feel afterwards? What was the consequence of me choosing to watch porn? How did I feel about myself afterwards?
Yeah.
And thinking about those and recognizing where your weaknesses are, both emotionally and physically, I think is helpful, so that you can avoid getting yourself into the situation in the first place. And I'd say that the other thing too is just to be really brutal. So in my case, I bought an alarm clock, and I don't have my phone in the night, which is a minor inconvenience at times, but that was what it took, because I knew that nighttime especially was a triggering time of the day, and especially when I feel tired and all of that. I have guy friends who, and I wish that I could have done this. It's just not practical for me in my situation. But I know guys that got rid of their smartphones in general, and they switched over to flip phones. They can still text and everything. But I think you really have to. You might listen and say this sounds extreme, but if that's what it's going to take for you to feel freedom, I promise you, it's worth it. It is so worth it. I know other people that, and this is something I personally do too. Not that my problem has been mostly with my phone, but if I'm ever using a laptop or anything, I'm always doing so in a public space. It doesn't come into my room. I'm always in a place where, anybody could walk through at any given point of time. So be really brutal with it, and understand that what you feed will grow. There's this verse about, no man can serve two masters. And so are we acting in obedience, or are we disobeying? And realizing too that God doesn't give us these guidelines because he's mean, but because he cares more deeply about our joy and our peace than we do. And he knows what will bring us joy and peace.
Yeah.
So I always think my mom,
True.
Gave this illustration growing up where she talks about, if you have two dogs, the one you feed is going to get stronger. So what are you feeding? But then also understanding that you have a way out. It might feel awkward, but if you're in a situation, you can turn the TV off. If you're with a group of friends, once again, I know it might feel awkward, but it's okay to say, hey, I'm either going to, can we switch to something else, or, or just take yourself elsewhere in the room. I saw this other great quote where it talked about how, you might not always be able to control what's served to you, but you can control what you eat. And so I think it's important to know that, and to stop making excuses too, like what I did, where it's like, well, it's just this. Like, even if it's, looking through articles in, women's magazines or whatever that talk about like sex, like, and you're like, well, this isn't porn. The Bible talks about how God's standard is not even a hint of sexual immorality, like not even a hint. And so don't go near it. And I think having a plan of action. So like knowing, okay, who can I call if I'm struggling? What can I do? What drastic measures have I taken in place to prevent? And what am I going to do as well if I do stumble? Because you might. Once again, you could have a total amazing night and day story where, you just stop one day and that's it. But if you relapse, know that, you're not a worse Christian for it, but how are you going to bounce back quickly? And how are you going to, repent and do that well? And how are you going to get back up on your feet? Who are you letting into your story? Who are you letting speak into your life? And what are you seeing and watching and all of that? So
I think it's also important to remember that your journey with God and to freedom, whatever area it is that you're struggling with, is not a linear thing. And so when you stumble, it's not like you're back to square one. It's kind of more like a scribble. And even if you surround the same tree 10 times, each time you circle it with new information and more experience. And so you never start back at square one. That's not how it is. It's not like it's not a ladder and you fell down and now you have to start again. No, you just start where you left off. And that's okay. Like, even if you manage to overcome for a month and then you struggle for another month, and then it's about not giving up. It's about knowing that Jesus is with you in it, and that his heart for you is not sin management. It is true freedom, and you can only find that in him. It's not to always live in the space of like trying to manage your sin, but really feeding your spirit and mind so that you get to a place where you believe in the freedom that he already bought for you, that you walk into that and no longer. And then maybe at times I think for some people, maybe the restrictions need to always be that strict. But I think the more we feed our spirits, the more we spend time with Jesus, the less restrictions you have to put in place, because you won't need to entertain those type of things. Instead of saying, oh, I don't watch this type of movie because of this, you just won't be interested because you want to do things that bring life. And then again, you move completely away from managing your sin into a space where you're just so focused on Jesus that you don't even think about all the things that you've struggled with before or that could tempt you. Of course, our journey, again, it's not linear. So even if you get to that space, there's still a chance that you might stumble again. But you never start at the beginning. And there's just always so much grace if you're willing to repent and talk about it. I think Brene Brown speaks about shame so well, and one of the main things that she says is that firstly, shame goes away when we talk about what's going on. When we open up and we're vulnerable, it takes shame away. But the second thing that I think is also very relevant to your story that she says is that the only way you can rewrite the ending of your story is if you actually own it. Is if you're able to say, oh, well, I was addicted to this, or at the, before you found freedom, saying, oh, I am addicted to that, and realizing I can now rewrite the story because I owned it, because I realized, what is my story right now? Oh, I don't want that to be my story anymore. How do I change that? But if you deny the things, if you deny your own story, if you deny your own narrative that you have written, you take away your own ability to rewrite it, to change the narrative.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. I love this quote from Isom. She's written an excellent book called Sex, Jesus, and Other Conversations the Church Forgot. And she talks about how, when we fail to talk about the issue of pornography, we're actually failing to talk about the power that the Holy Spirit has to purify our eyes, reclaim our hearts, and break our chains of bondage to these sorts of things. And so, yeah, I'd say that coming forward is super important, and understanding too that being met with love from other people and acceptance, that doesn't mean that they're saying that what you're doing is okay. And I think that one of the things that we need to learn, and this is something I'm still journeying with, is understanding the difference between shame and conviction. And I've just written down some things that have been helpful to me. And even though I've been walking in freedom, like those feelings of shame definitely still do come up, where it's like, how did I even get myself into this in the first place? And, and all of that. So, I'd say something that's helpful is when you're wrestling with, okay, is this a thought of shame or conviction, and should I entertain it? Shame freezes you. It'll tell you that, you'll always be this way, that you can't overcome it. You're just too messed up. Whereas conviction will free you. It will give you a call to action and a call to return back. Shame, I think, attacks you as a person. So if you're, having these thoughts and it's attacking you, you're so broken. You're just dirty and shameful and gross. That's the voice of shame, whereas conviction will actually attack the problem. Okay, you wrestled with this. How do we deal with now? And I think the kind of maybe the most important is shame will tell you who you are. So once again, going back to like, you are broken, you are disgusting, you are dirty, whereas conviction will tell you whose you are, and remind you that, listen, like, you are beloved, you are forgiven, you are set free. You have the power of the Holy Spirit in you. You are a daughter of, or a son of God, and He's offered you freedom. And you're not really acting like who you are right now. So how are we going to repent, and how are we going to turn from that and run back into the arms of our Father? So I think that's something that's also really important to consider, because those feelings of shame are very deep, and they have very real consequences, but they are lies. They are lies, and we have to realize that. And you are not obligated to carry around those lies. It doesn't mean that you're justifying what you're doing, but it means that you're placing those feelings in the rightful place, which is in the arms of Jesus, because He died. He died for our shame. He died for these things. And so it's walking with His help and realizing we don't have to do this in our own strength and alone.
So true. It's like shame tries to drag you down, but conviction kind of wants to lift you up, saying like, no, but you are loved, you are worthy, so let's act in alignment with that, rather than saying that your actions now define you. It's saying, let's live from a place of freedom and love. So to round this conversation up, could you tell us what you are chasing right now?
Yeah. I love this question that you ask at the end of every podcast. I've been very much learning to love God for who He is and not for who I want Him to be. So there's been a few just difficult things that have happened, and I've lost a friend recently to cancer, and have watched him journey down that road for 2 years now, and so it's practically been understanding that, like, God's sovereignty and His power and His kindness are not mutually exclusive, and that He is still healer, even though He didn't heal in that situation. And so just learning to love Him for, once again, who He is and His character, and just having a deeper understanding of his goodness and his kindness, even in the midst of suffering, and not just placing my ideas of, well, I think that you should heal all the time, and I can't reconcile that you're a kind God and a good God because you didn't act in the way that I wanted you to act in this situation. So that's what I've been chasing, God for who he is.
Yeah, that's such a powerful and such a relevant thing. I think that's something that like this kind of like new wing or liberal Christians, or I don't even know, woke Christianity, I don't even know what you want to call it, but very often it's the case that people only want to love God if he fits into our box. But I always describe God as a kaleidoscope, because I'm like, God is just, but his justice does not necessarily look like our justice. And like Paul says, like, but who are you? Like, no offense, but who are you to really question why God is doing what he's doing? He's God, you're not. So yeah, that's a very interesting journey. But Sarah, I just wanted to thank you so much for coming on here. Thank you for sharing your testimony, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. This has been so wonderful.
That's it from me, guys. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a second to rate this podcast, write a review, and share it with your friends. Have a beautiful day, and remember that you are so loved.